let's start. So we do an interview about two main topics. The first one will be about retrogrades in Vedic astrology. There's a slightly different concept to what they mean in Western astrology. The main thing is that I'm slightly aware of retrogrades in Western astrology, and we have just gone through a phase of several planets being in retrograde, which astronomically is kind of an illusion. And I think Dr. Bhatt, he's a South Indian astronomer who's quite well known in Russia apparently, made it very clear why this happens astronomically, mainly because the planets are not all on an ecliptic plane around the sun, as we learned in school, but they're actually trailing behind the sun like a comet. And Cliff High has pointed this out several times also. So basically, the planets are in a spiral behind the sun, and so therefore you have the stepping of Venus through the sun, for instance, when you have the transition through the sun. And but still in astrology, you have this seemingly looping back of the planets from an Earth perspective. And in Western astrology, I think that's mostly associated with the reverse action of this planet. So if like Mercury, I think does that, then you have like a not very good time for communication, and things are going backwards basically. Right. So the question would be if this is the case also in Indian astrology, and how does Indian astrology deal with these retrogrades?
Okay, so in Indian astrology, which is based on Indian astronomy, we have a huge field in the Indian tradition called the Ganita, which really deals with astronomy. Now, we cannot do astrology without astronomy, because the astrological interpretations are based on based on astronomical configurations, right? Which we also know in Western astronomy to be exactly the same. Sometimes, actually, if you really study the Indian astronomy, it's incredibly advanced compared to Western astronomy. This is something that we don't realize. Now, in Indian astronomy, not astrology, the planet rotates around. Let me back up. The sun is not stationary, as we seem to understand it in Western science. The sun also rotates. It's a star, but it rotates, and it does a full rotation of 36,000 years. Okay. Now, as it rotates,
and around what point would it rotate then?
You find that the center, if you use that as a marker, because it goes around the elliptical circle, so you'll find it. No, you find it going through the Milky Way.
Yeah, I mean, I know this 36,000 years remind me a little bit about world ages or Yuga cycles, and I think
exactly.
Sri Yukteswar, for instance, and a group around him of Vedic astronomers or astrologers have dealt with this and published something about this also.
Yeah. So basically, this is a fundamental, one of the prerequisites, or one of the factors that is taken into consideration when we calculate the yugas. Mm-hmm. So the 36,000 years is the rotation, the full rotation of the sun. Okay. Now, so that definitely indicates that the sun is not stationary and that it has its own movement. Now, what the sun does is that it moves, and as it moves, it drags all the planets that is associated to this star, which is the sun, as we know it as sun. So the sun drags a harem of planets. I call it a harem because if you have the sun as, the guy, then you have all these, a harem of planets that follow it. As the sun leads, then you have a harem of planets following wherever the sun goes. Now, of course, the planets rotate in an elliptical circle, like more in a cylindrical circle. So basically, if you're looking at each planet, it would be more like each planet would be going into a spiral.
Yeah, so it's a trail, basically.
Exactly. Right. So, of course, then you find some of those factors come into consideration. In fact, what we looked at, and I've lectured even to you guys in Dar es Salaam, in one of the lectures I talked about, the December 12 night, 2012, was where the sun was at its midpoint in the center of the galaxy.
Yeah, so it's like a wave going on the outer edge of the galaxy, basically.
That's right. So it was emerging out of it. And this is where it began, 2012, December 2012, was when we could say was the marking point of a new phase, a new 36,000-year cycle.
So it's going through the ecliptical plane, basically, that goes through the center of the galaxy, and the sun goes up and down in this.
That's right. It goes in a circular fashion. So basically it goes up, and then it will come, it will take 18,000 years before it starts going down the spiral again.
Okay.
So, but the fact is that as the sun moves, it drags all these planets with it. So to visualize it, it's like, the main guy walking ahead and a harem of 9 planets following it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's of course like driving behind a large truck. So you have kind of a semi-vacuum, or you have like protected by the windshield in front of you, which is the
exactly sun. Yeah. So you can look at that analogy too. So while we're looking at the sun, we also have to. So this is the astrological understanding of the movement of the planets and the sun. Now, of course, every planet has a vibration. It creates a vibration. So, for instance, like a boat in a river or on a lake, as it moves, it creates a wave that is separate from the wave of the lake or the sea.
Yeah.
Okay. So every planet in its movement, it creates certain vibrations, certain waves. Okay. And so, for instance, when we are on Earth, we see the impact of moon on Earth. Okay. And just the same way, with the moon, we can visibly see it, we can experience it, but the same way, all of the other planets actually create their own vibration.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, an electrical field. No, I mean, you have this electrical universe theory that's getting stronger and stronger. Basically, that there seems to be also electrical potentials between planets, and they seem to be balancing out or trying to ground. And
if we put it into electrical form, we're actually sort of debasing it, because this energy, they are very much more powerful. They're not just electrons.
Yeah, I mean, it's electromagnetism, so it's I think electrics is just a part of this whole thing, but I think it's analog to how an atom is built up by electrons and the proton in the middle. To some degree, it's not the same.
So we can say that it has its own. It has a certain a gross factor to it, but the vibration is actually subtle and powerful and has deeper meaning and deeper. Okay, so it's like love. And so the question is, how do you take love and put it into a gross form? But we as human beings, we are the grossness. The human body is the gross part of the body that expresses love, the energy. Okay, so all of these vibrations have a subtle energy, and they also have a physical manifestation, which we can say in a crude way, because we kind of, it would be a grand generalization, a gross generalization, to put it in an electronic form. But the point is that there is a wave and there's an energy. Okay, that each planet creates in that. So let's say if you're in a lake, a very still lake, and you have 9 boats driving around, each in different directions, all of those boats create waves, right? So depending where you are, depending on what boat you're close to, you'll feel the impact of the boat that is closest to you. Similarly, as the sun moves and drags this harem of planets, each planet then creates a vibration. Now, we should look at the Earth as part of the harem. Yeah. But the thing is, we do not consider the impact of the Earth because we are on Earth. So for instance, if you are in one of the 9 boats on the lake, you won't feel the impact of your own boat. You're going to feel the waves of the other boats. You see the difference I'm trying to make?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So that's the main difference also between astrology and astronomy, you know, that the one is objective, the other one's more subjective.
Exactly. And this is so if we take it to a boat analogy, like on a lake, because we still look at a still lake, not a lake with waves, to understand how those 9 different boats in a still lake would impact me and where I stand. Because if I'm on the banks of the river, of the lake, then the waves don't have so much of an impact unless I'm actually in the water.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm in my own boat, and all these 8 other boats are rotating around me, then they'll create a certain wave, and all those combinations of the 8 boats will have an impact on my stability and my comfort in my boat.
Yeah, I mean, that's just basically the same understanding in Western astrology.
Correct.
And yeah, so I mean that from an objective way, there's actually nothing like a retrograde if you look from the sun perspective, or from outside the solar system. But exactly. From this specific boat, you see these retrogrades. So basically, it's
right. So you see. Let's say you see one of the boats. Okay, it comes towards you from the back, and it goes faster than you, and it passes you. And it goes further down the lake towards the end. And then it turns around and it comes back towards you. So you see what happens. In fact, the Greeks, when they did, when I got into Greek astrology, this is one of the concepts that the Greeks talked about very well, which I would say that also came from India. So the impact that I get as being in my boat on the lake is different when there's a boat behind me approaching me, because it approaches with quite a fast speed and I hear the noise. And as it passes me, it creates certain very close waves where my boat would rock sideways. And then it passes away, then the following waves in the back will come to rock my boat. As it gets to the end and then turns around, I have a different impact. Okay, so the same way, the planets have a different impact. Mm-hmm. You find that in Indian astrology, we look at retrogrades as the planet coming back towards me. Okay. Just as the planet is approaching me.
And does it mean, if you take the same analogy with the waves, that, I mean, if it both passes you and then comes back, you have a very kind of confusing cross wave patterns, no?
Yes, I had.
Because partly they will cancel each other out, so you have like higher amplitudes, basically. And
right. As I'm driving my boat, because my boat is in motion. My boat is not stationary. So let's look at it from this perspective. I'm on the Earth, a boat called Earth, right? And there's a planet behind me that's faster, or a boat that is faster, and it approaches me. So when something approaches me, it creates an impact because there's that force from behind. So, for instance, if I'm walking down the street and there's someone running behind me, I can feel that person even before without turning to look at that person. And my natural instinct is to make way or step aside so that I let that person go. Okay? So when a planet comes closer to Earth, it has more of an impact because the vibration is felt stronger.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can we maybe get an example of perhaps Mercury that you can perhaps explain what happens if Mercury comes from behind and how it is perceived when it comes back from the front side, and basically going through the steps of...
Right. So basically, from the Earth's perspective, if I'm heading straight, like for instance, let's use the example of driving on a road, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm driving on a road and I'm heading in one direction and all the planets are heading in that direction, that means that we are on the right lane. So when Mercury is behind me, and Mercury is faster than the Earth, so Mercury tends to move faster. So we experience the rotation of the Mercury 3 or to 5 times a year.
Yeah.
Okay. So when Mercury comes from behind me, that is a positive direction in terms of or relative to my direction.
Yeah, so the qualities of Mercury getting enhanced basically through his
Exactly. So as it approaches me, I feel it more.
Yeah.
Because it brings the energy and the sphere of that energy that Mercury carries, I feel the impact more. So if a person is 1 mile behind me, I will not feel it, even though it might be on my radar. But as it comes closer to it, I would see it approaching faster. And not only that, I would see it approaching faster, I would hear the vibration, I would see the object. And the more and more closer it gets to me, I have a tremendous impact. So you find that when a car is a mile behind, I might see it at a distance as a tiny, tiny object. But as it approaches me, it becomes huge. And I see it real. And I have to make sure that that lane is clear so that Mercury can pass me. So let's say Mercury is a truck, in a distance, it's a tiny object. When it comes close, it's humongous.
Yeah.
And it's loud and it's noisy.
So, I mean, we just had a Mercury retrograde, no? Until when did it end?
I think a few, I don't remember the exact date, I think it was 18th of, it went direct on 18th of August.
Yeah, okay.
So it was very, very soon, yeah.
So we had basically, so maybe we can take this as an example that when Mercury entered into retrograde this year, what would happen then? I mean, before that you were...
So using this direction of the road analogy and even the boat analogy, Mercury passes. So when Mercury is going in the same direction as me, it does what it's naturally meant to do. So that means, when it comes closer, there's more communication going on, and it's right communication. Things are working fine. There's usually no problems. But then let's say Mercury goes down the road and says, oh my God, that guy who's driving, I want to talk to him. And then stops and turns around and heads your way because they want to talk to me. All right. Now that is going against the flow. So what happens is when a planet is coming towards me from the opposite end, it's not natural. And what that simply means is that it creates a different opposition, an energy of opposition, an energy of conflict, an energy of problems.
So misunderstanding probably, in
misunderstanding.
The case of Mercury.
So astrologically, now this is the astronomical, it's an illusion based relative to the Earth. So when a planet goes away or comes from behind and goes on, that's planets moving in the right direction. When planets appear to come closer, then that is what we call retrograde. In that case, whatever happens is everything is in opposition rather in the flow. So if we're going down the river flow is down from higher elevation to lower elevation. But if this boat is coming back, it's going against the flow. Mm-hmm. So you find the energy of going against the stream is very different from going with the flow.
But that's similar to Western astrology, the interpretation.
That is correct. But, so to that extent is correct. So it's important to understand how it works in order to understand the difference.
Yeah. But didn't you say that there was more emphasis or so in Vedic astrology on these retrogrades, or a slightly different meaning or so?
Yeah. So if we look at Mercury, for instance, when it comes behind me, you find that things go along the way. When it comes in opposition to me, then things are disturbing. Okay, so we have the same way. Now, this is where Indian astrology and Western astrology and all the like Greek astrology, we all agree on this part.
Mm-hmm.
The difference happens is that when in Western astrology, we look at retrograde planets and we immediately dread it. We think of problems, we think of disasters, we think of all these negative implications. But then in Indian astrology, we take another factor which is usually not considered in Western astrology. When the retrograde planet comes towards me, it is actually very strong. It brings its energy with it, which is strong. It's like the boat approaching me or the car approaching me. We feel the impact just the way we felt the impact coming towards me from behind by Mercury, let's say, or a truck.
Mm-hmm.
The closer it gets to you, the more impact you feel. That is pretty obvious, whether it's a truck or a person, you know. So these planets, like for instance, when Mercury retrogrades and comes towards me, until it gets very close towards me, I am completely absorbed by Mercury's energy. But the difference is when the Mercury was going direct versus retrograde is that the two energies, although are the same, but they are different in the sense of what they do. So Mercury deals with communication, let's say. Indirect, when Mercury is direct, communication is good. When it's in opposition, when it comes opposite or in retrograde, communication breaks down. So far, with Western astrology, we are okay on that same page. However, in Indian astrology, what we look at, Mercury coming back, yes, indirect, we actually did something with an intention of accomplishing something. When it comes back, what happens is it disturbs that because that original communication was not complete or it was not done right. So when Mercury comes back again, it disrupts that communication so that we can revisit that issue in order to create a better system.
Okay, so it's like you have a dialogue and then you have a question and an answer, and then you're not entirely happy with the answer and you ask the question again, but formulate it in a different way, for instance.
Exactly, right. So another example, let's say you and I decided to do something when Mercury was direct. Okay, but you and I agreed on it with limited information, so we didn't know what we needed to know. So down the road, as we are working on something, and this happens in every project, we realized that there was some other wrinkle or some other information we needed that is relevant to what we're trying to accomplish. Mm-hmm. Now, during retrograde, what happens is usually we see things that we haven't seen before. And so that communication, what we intended to do, does not work out very well during Mercury retrograde. So that gives us an opportunity to look at it again so that we can make it better. Now, in Western astrology, because that breakdown is considered negative and we dread it, in India, we look at that as a very positive thing.
Okay, so that's a big difference then, because Western astrology is like a lot of Western belief systems. It's very dualistic. So you have something is either good or bad, and in this case, retrograde would be bad in Western astrology. And right. Basically, you try to, in Mercury retrograde, you would not do important negotiations or something like that. So that's quite a difference, I think.
Exactly. And another way to give you an example is, let's say you and I are close, but you are behind me. Now you are talking to me, I will still hear you, right? But that communication is very different from you standing opposite me and you and I having a conversation while you are facing me. Okay, which conversation would you prefer, standing behind me and talking to me, or facing me and talking? So there is negative sides of it, there's positive sides of it, but the fact is that if you're standing opposite me, then you and I can have an eye-to-eye conversation, which is much better than you sitting behind me and talking to me.
Yeah, it also sounds a bit like maybe if you are getting into psychoanalysis for a moment, it would maybe be analog to the role of a parent standing behind the kid and talking down to the kid, and then the kid grows up and stands in front of the parent, and then they talk on an equal level, for instance, and then maybe the parent ages and becomes a bit senile, and then the kids.
Right.
So it's kind of three different ways of doing a dialogue,
right,
and reaching different levels of understanding. No?
Yeah, exactly. So given that background, you see what happens is in Indian astrology, we consider retrogrades to be powerful, more powerful than direct. So when you are standing in front of me, that is much more powerful conversation than you standing behind me. Like you said, your example is very good of a parent behind. The planet might be incredibly powerful right behind me, but in front of me, it's much more pleasant. So planets not only are dreadful in situations, but it also is much better when you have a face-to-face communication if we have harmony. So when you and I have a conversation and we're happy and we get along, then the conversation is amazing. But then if you and I are face-to-face and we dislike each other and we hate each other, and then so we start having a fight. So basically retrogrades have exactly the same impact. If the retrograde planet is there with me, and I don't like that planet, I don't get along with that planet, then of course things will break down. So the retrogradation, in fact, in Indian astrology is one of the most valuable things. It's powerful, it's more powerful than a regular, when the planet is direct, because of the impact it would have on me, on Earth, right? So that's number one. Number two, the way we look at retrograde planets is usually the negative karmas playing out. Okay, so usually that's when the planets start delivering the negative karmas. Thirdly, what it does is that if it's not a negative karma, if it is a positive thing, it gives us an opportunity to see something we had not seen when the planet was direct.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so in that many ways, yes, it creates disruption. Whenever Mercury is retrograde, everybody fears it because there's a breakdown of communication. There's problems. Anything you start if you start a project, for instance, when Mercury is retrograde, then guaranteed you'll have to redo that project over again.
Okay, so you would start the project before the retrograde and then revisit it and rework it through. Yeah.
So in Vedic astrology, when I pick auspicious times, for instance, or when I do horary astrology, that is one of the greatest things to look at. And in astrology, we don't spend time doing it. But if you look at when Titanic was created, it started at the worst time. When it got launched, it was one of the deadliest times. When it left the port for its fateful journey, it was at one of the worst times you could possibly imagine. Okay, so that's why we had a deadly result. And this is true with every project in the world. You know, it's very interesting to look at Elon Musk's SpaceX launches. I mean, it's so uncanny that every time he launches his rockets, they're at the worst possible time. I mean, I've looked at it and I'm like, there was one flight that exploded. It was at the worst possible time. And I looked at that, I was looking at it astrologically, and I'm like, how can this guy even do this? It's going to be a disaster. And of course it exploded, you know. But of course he didn't call me to actually ask time for those times. But anyway, when Mercury is direct, that's the best time to plant the seed of a project.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we have a little bit of time left for this session, and then maybe do the other one in a separate interview. Maybe can you? So there are basically only Mercury and Venus that can be retrograde, or also the outer planets.
No, the outer planets too. In fact, Jupiter. The only problem is Mercury retrogrades for 3 weeks. The other planets retrograde longer.
A long time.
So Jupiter just finished its retrogradation recently, and Saturn is going to be retrograding on 6th of September. So, for instance, on 5th, 6th, 7th, we're going to see some deadly results on the Earth, like, for instance, explosions, earthquakes, volcano, and those kind of drastic worldwide impact, because this is one of the things that happens when Saturn retrogrades. So,
Armin, was ist los? Nein, sei bitte still, ich bin an einem Interview, bitte. Ja, warte einen Moment. Sorry.
no worries.
Just, yeah.
So what happens is Saturn is going direct on September 6th. On top of it, it also has the eclipse factor, which came in. So we're going to see some deadly results in the first week of September, and even maybe till the 10th of September, because there's a lag factor also. So depending on the individual charts of the countries or people, they will have an impact. So Saturn is going direct on the 6th of September.
Mm-hmm.
And,
okay.
but this is based on Vedic astrology.
I mean, that's quite interesting because there is, I just try to maybe share this in a moment. Let's see if I can do that. Do you see this chart?
Right.
On the screen? So that's basically a kind of a cheat sheet for the S-curve development. I mean, we are jumping here now to cryptocurrencies again.
Okay.
And something that comes to my mind is that you have this S-curve here,
right.
which basically is the start of the development here. And you can apply this to the telecom revolution, to the internet revolution, to emergence of cars or airplanes until all these markets, until the market is saturated here at the top when you have maturity. Right. And apparently there is a kind of, in all these S-curves of markets developing, there seems to be a turning point and an interruption. And that kind of reminds me very much of this retrograde issue, because it looks like the whole development, I mean, the cryptocurrencies are building up, then the mainstream media picks them up and they go really crazy in last December, for instance, 2017.
Right.
And then there's suddenly a gap and everything comes to a standstill, apparently.
That's correct, yeah.
And looks like it's being revisited. And so that's, I've found that quite interesting because
and so you see this. This is typical when we look at all S curves, and in fact, every development and saturation, whether it's business cycles or project cycles, all of them actually go through these cycles that we talk about. And frankly, all of them, every project in the world can be seen from an astrological lens.
Yeah.
To see its turning point, because that would be when the planet is stationary. And then it starts turning back. And then you see the high saturation is when the planet is coming back or the project is coming back to full maturity. So that is exactly true with every cycle. So you find that everything that we do on Earth is correlated with the influence of the planets.
Yeah. I mean, it looks like if we come back to cryptocurrency as an example, I mean, we had, I think, now the Mercury retrograde and Jupiter as well and Saturn, no?
Yes.
I think 3 planets. And one after the other, now they go in forward motion again. And
actually, this spring we had about 5 planets retrograde. We had Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mercury retrograde. So all of them, and that's why we went into this turmoil period. You find a lot of riots at that point. There's a lot of disturbances, unsettlement. People were frustrated. And so suddenly now, one by one, we're coming out of the retrogradation.
Yes, it's quite interesting because that fits so nicely with this S-curve cheat sheet that has this strange interruption where, I mean, of course, there's still cryptocurrency companies out doing a lot of work and development is happening in the background, but on the surface, you kind of have this strange seeming interruption of the development, no? And it's kind of a revisiting of of certain topics. It's apparently taking place in the background.
I mean, this thing happens with currencies. It happens with fashion. It happens with project. I mean, everything you look at, you'll be amazed to see the correlation with every event with astrology.
So you have basically a crisis at a certain point where you have to redesign the whole project.
I mean, you know, when we talk, for instance, and we'll talk about this later more deeply, but when we look at the saturation of the paper currency, and when it started, you see that life cycle is almost about 100 years.
So that's an interesting topic. I think the time is almost up. Okay. So let's then end this session here. And
come back again.
Thanks a lot. Come back with a new topic.
Okay.